If you were in a sinking lifeboat, would you throw someone overboard to save the rest? And more importantly, would you ever dare record their name in the ship's official law?
Oh, wow.
Right? Today's critique examines Dr. Pooyan Ghamari's essay on 5 Oaths, a sweeping exploration of Swiss history that questions whether a nation's prosperity merely serves as an incomplete ledger hiding its true human costs. So a key theme running through this material seems to be the tension between survival and morality, which brings me directly to our first structural observation.
Okay, let's hear it.
The foundational conflict in the 1291 crossing establishes a compelling moral dilemma, yet it overlooks the practical, systemic trade-offs required for initial state building.
I see where you're going with that because, well, the text is clearly laying out this incredibly intimate, claustrophobic scene on Lake Zurich.
Right, it's very contained.
Exactly. You have Anna, Look, the ferryman, and they're facing this agonizing decision to leave Conrad behind to his pursuers.
Yeah, it's a huge moment.
It is. It's designed to be a microcosm of a larger societal promise, forging a bond in the crucible of immediate danger. And the splinter Anna takes, carving the first notch into it, it becomes this deeply personal anchor for the entire national mythos.
It's incredibly poignant. And as I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that the first oath, no one among us will be surrendered alone, is born from this very paradox.
Yes, they establish a definitive we by actively abandoning someone who falls outside of it.
Exactly. But here's the core weakness of this section. The text frames the decision to leave Conrad behind primarily as a contradiction of solidarity.
Okay.
It misses the realist argument that any nascent nation-state must operate with selective memory and brutal, pragmatic trade-offs simply to ensure baseline survival.
Oh, I see. So you're saying it treats the abandonment as this tragic, almost philosophical flaw?
Yeah, exactly, rather than an operational necessity for a state that doesn't even exist yet.
That makes sense. But could the evidence also support a different conclusion? Like the idea that acknowledging this moral failure is exactly what makes the later oaths necessary in the first place?
How so?
Well, if they don't feel the crushing guilt of leaving Conrad, they don't carve that first notch into the wood, right? The guilt is the genesis of the nation's conscience.
I hear that, driver. But from an institutional realist perspective, guilt is a luxury you can only afford once you are safely on the shore.
Fair point.
When the pursuers are literally on your heels, there's no time for moral accounting.
True.
But I can see what you're going for here with the focus on the moral weight of the splinter. So let's see how we can strengthen this from a narrative structure standpoint.
Okay, what's the suggestion?
To resolve this, the suggestion is to heighten the dialectical tension by having the narrative explicitly stress test whether exposing these hidden accounts might actually undermine the very institutional trust required for the community to function.
Oh, that's interesting. So building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of the immediate political fallout?
Yes, exactly.
If you've just survived a harrowing escape, and you immediately start pointing fingers about who got left behind and why.
You risk fracturing the alliance.
Right, the very alliance that just saved your lives. You can't draft a constitution while everyone is accusing each other of betrayal.
No, you can't.
The solidarity, even if it's built on a massive omission, is functionally required.
You absolutely need the myth of total solidarity just to get the community off the ground. So for a concrete example of how to implement this, when Anna cuts the first notch in the wood, have the text briefly introduce a counter-perspective.
Through one of the other characters?
Yeah, perhaps through the ferryman's economic demands.
Oh, I like that.
The ferryman could argue that sacrificing Conrad isn't just a moral failure to be mourned, but a necessary institutional mechanism for survival.
Because he's the one actually managing the logistics of the escape.
Exactly. He demands his toll, and he dictates the weight the boat can carry. He becomes the voice of absolute, cold-blooded statecraft.
So the ferryman isn't just a background character rowing the boat anymore.
Right.
He represents the unforgiving math of sovereignty. He doesn't care about the moral dilemma or the oaths,
Not at all.
He cares about the toll, the displacement of water, and the risk to his own livelihood.
Yeah.
That introduces a fascinating friction because it forces Anna's idealism to violently clash with raw pragmatism.
Precisely. Let me give you an analogy to really cement what I mean here. Compare this 1291 crossing to a lifeboat scenario in the middle of a freezing ocean.
Okay.
The boat is taking on water. You have to make the brutal decision to throw someone overboard so the rest can survive.
Right, it's terrible, but it's survival.
But if you sit there and immediately start writing down the names of those thrown overboard in a permanent ledger,
Oh, yeah.
if you're demanding a full moral accounting while the storm is still raging, you risk starting a mutiny that sinks the ship entirely.
That makes total sense.
Selective memory isn't just a convenient lie. In the early stages of state building, it is the glue that holds the whole together.
That's a fascinating way to frame it. What are the potential limitations or counterarguments to that idea, though?
Will you tell me?
Because while a nation might begin in a lifeboat, it cannot remain in one forever.
True.
If you build your entire civilization on the logic of the lifeboat, and you codify that brutal pragmatism into your laws,
You're setting a dangerous precedent.
exactly. You eventually build a society that is incredibly efficient at throwing people overboard whenever the economic waters get rough.
Wow. Yeah.
The survival tactic scales up into a permanent system of exclusion.
And that conceptual bridge takes us directly into how this survival tactic evolves into permanent government over the centuries.
Right.
Because you can't run a permanent nation on lifeboat logic without severe consequences.
No, you really can't.
Which leads to our next point. The exploration of compounding moral debt throughout the subsequent historical oaths lacks a rigorous framework for identifying exactly how these exclusions render institutions fragile over time.
This is where we leap forward, right? To the Reformation, the Sonderbund War of 1847, and the industrial boom of the late 19th century.
Yes.
We move from a wooden rowboat on Lake Zurich to the massive infrastructure of a modernizing Europe.
Let's look closely at the section discussing the transition from the 1847 Sonderbund War into the 1848 federal state, and then later the 1882 Gotthard Tunnel construction.
Okay.
The material makes a strong case for the human cost by highlighting characters like Rainy Kellen, who witnesses the defeated Catholic forces after the war, and Elias Keller, a cartographer who only sees the world in terms of maps, transit routes, and economic value.
It is incredibly evocative writing, I have to say. The imagery of Elias drawing lines on parchment while ignoring the cultural bleeding happening on the ground, it's striking.
It really is.
However, the specific weakness in these middle chapters is that while the text beautifully illustrates exclusion through these characters, Vreni witnessing the defeated, or later Marco Rossi facing the physical dangers of the Gotthard, it misses the opportunity to systematically deploy the core diagnostic questions that reveal the mechanics of systemic fragility.
Right, it stays a bit too surface level in terms of the structure.
Exactly. We get the aesthetic of exclusion and the emotional resonance of it, which is great.
Yeah.
But the text doesn't quite unpack the structural math of how a hidden account actually bankrupts an institution's integrity over generations.
So, a key theme running through this material seems to be that a contract can be legally voluntary but economically coercive, which we absolutely see with Elias Keller's map-making.
Yes.
But you're arguing that the reader needs to see the actual gears of that coercion turning more explicitly.
Exactly that. If the structural rot is baked into the foundation, we need a lens to view it.
So what's the fix?
The core suggestion here is to anchor the transition between each historical leap in 4 specific diagnostic questions.
Okay, lay them out.
Who gains, who pays, who decides, and who is excluded from deciding,
Oh, I like that framework.
right? Using these questions consistently will prove that ignoring unrecorded costs inevitably creates institutional decay.
It makes it tangible.
Yes, because if you don't aggressively answer these 4 questions in the narrative, the moral debt just feels like a philosophical concept floating in the ether, rather than a tangible, compounding vulnerability in the nation's architecture.
I really like the analytical rigor of that approach. Let's apply it directly to the text.
Sure, let's do it.
For a concrete example, in the 1848 section with Elias Keller, explicitly frame his map-making around the question of who decides and who is excluded from deciding the new federal state structure.
Okay, yes.
Elias is drawing railway lines and cantonal borders that dictate future transport routes and economic hubs, right?
He is.
If the narrative forces Elias to articulate that the defeated Catholics of the Sonderbund are completely excluded from the room where these maps are drawn, it fundamentally proves that a legally voluntary contract is economically coercive.
Because they have no say in the infrastructure.
Exactly. The victors aren't just taking land. They are monopolizing the right to define what the future looks like.
And because the defeated are excluded from deciding, they are effectively under siege without a single shot being fired.
Wow, well put.
They are forced to participate in a national economy where they are fundamentally disadvantaged from day one.
Yeah.
That perfectly maps out the who decides and who is excluded part of the framework. It turns cartography into a weapon of statecraft.
It really does. And to cover the other half of your diagnostic framework, we can look at the fourth oath, belonging, in the late 19th century.
Yes, the Gotthard Tunnel construction in 1882. Is the connection between A and B fully established in the material, or is that an area to potentially bolster?
Let's see. The text introduces Marco Rossi, an Italian migrant worker who has the technical understanding to see the geological dangers that the bosses miss.
But absolutely no social power to stop them.
None at all. And then generations later, we have Elizabeth Keller discovering the business records of that construction.
Right, so to bolster that connection, here is another concrete example. Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of contrasting those business ledgers?
Tell me more.
Use Elizabeth's discovery of the ledgers to demonstrate how keeping laborers socially distant creates a structural, rather than just moral debt.
Okay.
Contrast the precise business ledgers she finds, which meticulously track materials, corporate profits, and the exact cost of dynamite, with the specific question of who pays the human price.
That is where the unwritten balance sheet becomes painfully literal, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly.
If the ledger tracks the cost of timber to the penny, but doesn't record the names of the men who die from silicosis or tunnel collapses,
Then the institution is operating on a fraudulent balance sheet.
yeah,
It is extracting massive economic energy, the labor of migrant workers, without recording the liability of their lives.
it's chilling when you put it like that.
And that isn't just a sad historical footnote. From a systemic standpoint, it makes the entire enterprise incredibly fragile.
Because the foundation is hollow.
Right, because you are relying on a workforce that you are actively alienating and refusing to integrate.
It's the lifeboat logic rearing its head again.
Exactly.
The institution is treating the migrant workers like they are disposable weight, ready to be thrown overboard the moment the tunnel is finished and the ribbon is cut.
Yep.
But you cannot build a permanent stablemation on the backs of a permanent marginalized underclass. Eventually, the structural debt comes due,
It always does.
which raises a massive question as we move into the present day. If this debt has been compounding in the floorboards of the nation since 1291, how on earth do you settle it centuries later?
That conceptual bridge brings us directly to Basel in 2026. Can you simply legislate away centuries of unrecorded liabilities?
That is exactly the friction point, and it brings us to our third critique. The resolution in the 2016 timeline introduces a brilliant tension regarding historical restitution, but it assumes that modern governance can cleanly settle generational moral debts.
Right, because we are following Lina Rossi Dervishi, a forensic economist who inherits the physical artifacts of this entire lineage,
The brass matrix, the wooden splinter with its 4 notches.
and the hidden archive holding the truth about the unwritten balance sheet.
Yes, she applies her trade, she traces the money, the hidden interests, the silent handshakes.
Mm-hmm.
She discovers that her mother, Clara, protected Ruth Zing from certain ruin, but did so by hoarding the truth, which is a form of dispossession in itself.
Protection without participation.
Exactly. However, the weakness here is that Lena's ultimate decision to move the documents to independent custody and share decision-making power with Ruth feels slightly too neat.
It feels almost procedural, doesn't it?
It does. It bypasses the deeper, much more dangerous friction between long-term national myth-making and genuine anti-fragile sovereignty.
Is there a risk that focusing solely on a legalistic solution might overlook the psychological and national trauma involved?
Absolutely.
I mean, the text proposes that by removing the assets from the family's exclusive control and giving the affected people decision-making power, the fifth notch is carved not in wood, but in equitable action.
Which sounds great on paper.
It sounds beautiful. It sounds fair. But as you said, is it too procedural?
Yeah.
Does it feel like trying to use a modern compliance form to settle a 700-year-old blood debt?
Exactly. A forensic accountant is trained to find missing funds, but how do you audit missing generational power?
You really can't.
So the suggestion here is to aggressively stress test the metaphor of the hidden account by questioning whether constitutional oaths, archive transfers, or regulatory paperwork can ever truly resolve an unwritten balance sheet of this magnitude.
That's a profound challenge to the narrative's climax. But what are the potential limitations or counterarguments to that idea?
Let's unpack it.
Because we have to ask, what else is Lena supposed to do? She is operating in 2026. She can't go back and put Conrad in the boat.
Right.
She can't pull Marco Rossi out of the tunnel. She is doing the best she can within the confines of modern legal frameworks. Are we suggesting she should burn the archive down?
No, I'm certainly not saying she needs to burn it down. I'm saying the narrative needs to force her to sweat more over the sheer inadequacy of the solution.
Ah, okay.
For a concrete example, have Lena in her capacity as a forensic economist grapple with the terrifying realization that no ledger, no trust fund, and no independent custody arrangement can actually quantify generations of dispossession.
That's powerful.
You cannot put a dollar amount on centuries of being excluded from the room where decisions are made.
No, you really can't.
She needs to set up the independent custody knowing it is a profound compromise. It's a legal bandage on a tectonic fault line.
And we need to elevate the stakes of that compromise to a geopolitical level, right?
Yes, absolutely.
If Lena opens this archive to provide restitution for Ruth Zing, does she risk fracturing the modern state's stability?
That's the big question.
We should show Lena actively weighing the cost of absolute, unvarnished truth against the necessity of institutional stability. She knows the lifeboat was brutal. She knows the toll the ferrymen extracted was cruel. But she also knows the lifeboat is the only reason they have a prosperous country today.
That is the exact trap she needs to navigate. Make her refusal to cut the fifth notch into the wood a deeply conflicted, almost paralyzing geopolitical choice, rather than just a noble family rejection of past traditions.
It has to cost her something.
Yes. She shouldn't just be rejecting her mother's paternalism. She should be staring down the barrel of what absolute transparency actually does to a nation's foundational myths.
Oh, wow.
If the Swiss myth is perfect neutrality, perfect safety, and perfect prosperity, exposing a hidden account of this size might just bankrupt the myth of the nation itself.
And yet, if she doesn't expose it, if she locks the archive away again, the structural rot continues to hollow out the floorboards.
Exactly.
It is an impossible choice, but perhaps that is the ultimate synthesis of the essay's core provocation.
How so?
Facing the unwritten balance sheet isn't about setting out to maliciously destroy the state. It is the necessary, often excruciatingly painful price of true, mature, national sovereignty in the 21st century.
Okay, so what I really like about this part of our discussion is how we've arrived at the true definition of patriotism proposed by Dr. Pooyan Ghamari. Patriotism does not require hiding a country's fractures. It doesn't require pretending the lifeboat wasn't a brutal place.
Right.
True patriotism means believing that the country is strong enough to look at those fractures and survive the reflection.
It's the realization that anti-fragility isn't about having a perfect, spotless history. A spotless history is usually a heavily redacted one.
Very true.
True anti-fragility is about having institutions that can absorb the shock of their own foundational hypocrisies, audit their own moral debts, and adapt, rather than shatter under the weight of the truth.
I think that captures the essence of the work beautifully. Let's summarize the actionable feedback we've discussed to help strengthen already highly compelling material.
Sounds good.
First, introduce the institutional realist perspective in the 1291 crossing. Give the ferryman a voice to demand his toll, arguing that brutal pragmatism and selective memory are necessary mechanisms for early survival, which creates a true dialectical tension against the moral dilemma of solidarity.
Second, consistently apply the 4 diagnostic questions: who gains, who pays, who decides, and who is excluded across the subsequent historical eras.
Right.
Use Elias Keller's maps and Elizabeth Keller's ledgers as a rigorous analytical framework to show exactly how ignoring unrecorded human costs creates systemic, compounding fragility over time,
rather than just a lingering sense of guilt.
And finally, stress test Lena's modern restitution in the 2026 timeline. Show a forensic economist actively grappling with the terrifying limits of regulatory paperwork in settling historical moral debt. Force her to weigh the pursuit of absolute truth against the risk of fracturing modern institutional stability, making the climax a geopolitical tightrope walk.
Because if we trace it all the way back to that very first crossing on Lake Zurich, if you use the logic of the lifeboat to justify throwing people overboard to survive the storm, eventually, when the waters calm, you have to possess the institutional courage to read the names of those you sacrificed into the official record.
Wow.
Otherwise, you haven't really built a nation. You've just built a very successful, very well-organized lifeboat.
A powerful image to leave on. We invite the listener to revise the material with these systemic tensions in mind and submit it back to our discussion for further exploration. The unwritten balance sheet is open, and we look forward to seeing how the ledger evolves.